November 3rd, 2019. Vancouver Film Studios. Chen Wei-ming had choreographed death scenes for 30 years. Car crashes, building explosions, helicopter falls. He'd never performed CPR on a dying 7-year-old. Lucy's mother stood 10 feet away, filming everything on her phone. Not crying, not praying, just recording as Wei-ming pumped the small chest, counting compressions in Cantonese like his father taught him. November 3rd, 2019. Vancouver Film Studios. Chen Wei-ming had choreographed death scenes for 30 years. Car crashes, building explosions, helicopter falls. He'd never performed CPR on a dying 7-year-old. Lucy's mother stood 10 feet away, filming everything on her phone. Not crying, not praying, just recording as Wei-ming pumped the small chest, counting compressions in Cantonese like his father taught him. That's when Lucy opened her eyes, looked directly at him, and whispered the 4 words that would unravel everything. "Daddy, you came back." The film crew froze. Jackie Chan stepped backward. Even the paramedics arriving stopped to listen. Because Lucy Chen wasn't supposed to know Chen Wei-ming existed. Her mother had spent 7 years making sure of that. But dying children, Wei-ming would learn, sometimes remember things the living try to forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The paramedics' radio crackled to life, breaking the supernatural silence that had descended over stage 7. Wei-ming's hands trembled as he maintained the compression rhythm, but his eyes never left Lucy's face. Those dark eyes, so familiar yet impossible, stared back at him with a clarity that shouldn't exist in a child whose heart had stopped beating 90 seconds ago. "Sir, we need you to step back," the lead paramedic said, but his voice carried uncertainty. The entire crew had heard Lucy's words. In an industry built on make-believe, they'd all recognized the sound of absolute truth. Wei-ming lifted his hands slowly. Lucy's chest rose and fell on its own now, each breath shallow but steady. The color was returning to her cheeks, and those eyes, Christ, those eyes were exactly like David's at that age. "No," he whispered in Mandarin. Then louder in English. "No, this isn't possible." Behind the paramedics, Sarah Chen lowered her phone. For the first time since arriving on set, her carefully composed mask cracked. Wei-ming saw something flicker across her face, triumph mixed with terror, as if she'd just pulled the pin from a grenade and realized she was still holding it. Jackie Chan moved closer, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by the focused intensity Wei-ming had seen during their most dangerous stunts. "Wei-ming, do you know this child?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a pyrotechnic explosion. Wei-ming had spent 3 decades answering that same question about David. "Do you know your son? Where is David? Why isn't he here?" The entertainment press had feasted on the mysterious absence of the famous stunt coordinator's only child from every red carpet, every awards ceremony, every family photo opportunity. Wei-ming's throat closed. He watched the paramedics work, checking Lucy's vitals, preparing her for transport. She kept looking at him, and in her gaze he saw not just David's eyes, but David's stubborn determination. The same look his son had given him the last time they spoke, 8 years ago, when David had screamed that he never wanted to see his father again. "The child needs immediate medical attention," the paramedic announced. "We're taking her to BC Children's Hospital. Family only in the ambulance." Sarah stepped forward, but Lucy's small hand shot out, grasping air in Wei-ming's direction. "Daddy comes too," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the authority of someone who understood that time was finite. "Please, Mama, Daddy comes too." The words hit Wei-ming like a botched stunt where the safety cables snap. Daddy, not grandfather, not uncle, Daddy. Sarah's face went white. "Lucy, sweetheart, you're confused. This is—" "I know who he is," Lucy interrupted, her eyes never leaving Wei-ming's face. "I've been waiting for him to come back." The film crew shifted restlessly. Someone's cell phone camera was still rolling. Wei-ming could hear the electronic beep. By tomorrow, this moment would be dissected across every entertainment blog and social media platform in the world. But right now, all that mattered was the impossible mathematics of Lucy's existence. If she was David's daughter, that would make her 7 years old. David had died in a car accident in Toronto 3 years ago. Wei Ming had learned about it from a lawyer's phone call, formal and distant. No funeral invitation, no final words. Just paperwork to sign, releasing any claim to his son's modest estate. But if Lucy was 7, and David had died 3 years ago, where has she been? Wei Ming asked Sarah, his voice hoarse. Where have you been? Sarah's jaw tightened. That's not a conversation for here. Ma'am, we really need to go, the paramedic urged. Jackie placed a hand on Wei Ming's shoulder. Go, he said quietly. We'll wrap for today. Go with your family. The word family hit like a physical blow. For 30 years, Wei Ming's family had been the stunt teams he'd trained, the crews he'd protected, the actors he'd kept alive through increasingly impossible action sequences. He'd built his reputation on bringing everyone home safely, except for the 2 people who mattered most. As they loaded Lucy onto the stretcher, she reached for him again. Her small hand found his, and Wei Ming felt something he hadn't experienced since David was small, the desperate fear of losing someone who needed him to be brave. Will you tell me about Daddy? Lucy whispered as they wheeled her toward the exit. About my real daddy? Wei Ming's step faltered. Sarah walked on the other side of the stretcher, her face a mask of controlled fury and something else, grief maybe, or guilt. She knew exactly what she'd done by bringing Lucy here today. What do you want to know? Wei Ming managed. Lucy smiled, and for one impossible moment, she looked exactly like David had at 7 years old, before Hollywood schedules and broken promises had poisoned everything between them. Everything, she said. I want to know everything. As the ambulance doors closed behind them, Wei Ming realized that Sarah Chen hadn't just brought a dying child to meet Jackie Chan. She'd brought the past back to life, with all its sharp edges and unanswered questions. And somewhere in the space between Lucy's heartbeat and the wail of sirens, Wei Ming understood that this 7-year-old girl might be his last chance at redemption, or his final, most devastating failure. The ambulance swayed through Vancouver traffic, its siren cutting through the afternoon rain like a knife through silk. Wei Ming sat rigid on the narrow bench, watching Lucy's chest rise and fall beneath the oxygen mask, while trying to reconcile the impossible arithmetic of his grief. 7 years old, leukemia, David's daughter. The numbers refused to align with everything he thought he knew about his son's life. When David had walked out at 19, screaming that Wei Ming had chosen Jackie Chan over his own family, the silence that followed had been absolute. No phone calls, no letters, no photographs slipped under doors or emails sent in moments of weakness. Just the terrible quiet that accumulates between fathers and sons when pride becomes more important than love. Her vitals are stabilizing, the paramedic murmured, adjusting the 4-drip. Lucy's eyes fluttered open, finding Wei Ming immediately. Those dark irises held a startling awareness, as if she'd inherited not just David's stubborn chin, but his ability to see straight through people's carefully constructed defenses. Sarah sat opposite them, her fingers wrapped around Lucy's free hand. Up close, Wei Ming could see the exhaustion carved into her face, the hollow cheeks of someone who'd been fighting a losing battle for months, maybe years. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably early 30s, with David's same sharp intelligence reflected in her watchful silence. You look like him, Lucy whispered, her voice muffled by the mask. Mama has pictures, but she hides them when she thinks I'm not looking. The words landed like small explosions in Wei Ming's chest. Photographs. Hidden photographs of a grandfather Lucy had never met, kept secret by a mother who'd somehow tracked down his exact location on a closed film set 3,000 miles from wherever they'd been living their quiet tragedy. Pictures of your daddy? Wei Ming asked, leaning closer. Both of you, Lucy said, from when Daddy was little. You're teaching him to do somersaults in the backyard. He's laughing. Wei Ming's breath caught. He remembered that afternoon with sudden, brutal clarity. David, at 5 years old, determined to master a front flip after watching his father choreograph a rooftop chase sequence. They'd spent hours on the grass behind their Burnaby rental house, Wei Ming spotting David's attempts while promising they'd work on real stunts when he got bigger. When Wei Ming had more time, when the current film wrapped, when the next project allowed for longer weekends, Always when. I still have those pictures, Wei Ming said softly. In a box in my apartment. I haven't looked at them in 21 years, Sarah spoke for the first time since entering the ambulance. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd done extensive research. Not since David moved out. The precision of her knowledge was unsettling. Wei Ming studied Sarah's face, searching for clues about how she'd assembled the fragments of his family's destruction. How do you know that? David told me. Sarah's grip tightened on Lucy's hand. Everything. About the missed birthdays, the broken promises, the Christmas morning you chose to reshoot a car crash instead of opening presents. He told me about the day you said Jackie Chan's safety was more important than a Little League game. Each word was a surgical strike, precise and devastating. Wei Ming felt the familiar weight of guilt settling across his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd spent 3 decades telling himself that David would understand eventually, that providing for his family meant sacrificing time with them, that keeping Hollywood's biggest stars alive justified missing his son's childhood. He never forgave you, Sarah continued, her voice steady but edged with old pain. But he never stopped hoping you'd call. The ambulance turned sharply, throwing them against the padded walls. Lucy's heart monitor beeped faster, responding to the movement or perhaps to the tension crackling between the adults who bracketed her small form. "Mama," Lucy whispered, pulling at Sarah's sleeve. "Don't be angry at Daddy." He came back. The simple faith in those words broke something loose in Wei Ming's chest. He looked at this impossibly brave child, his granddaughter, a concept that still felt like science fiction, and saw the same optimism David had possessed before life taught him that promises were just words people use to fill uncomfortable silences. "I'm here now," Wei Ming said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Lucy or to the ghost of his son that seemed to hover in the cramped space between them. Through the ambulance's rear window, Vancouver's skyline blurred past in the rain. Somewhere out there, his apartment waited with its careful emptiness, its pristine surfaces unmarked by family photographs or children's drawings. For 30 years, he'd built a life around the absence of the people he'd failed to protect. But as Lucy's small fingers found his wrist, checking his pulse with the casual expertise of someone familiar with medical procedures, Wei Ming realized that Sarah hadn't just brought him a granddaughter. She'd brought him a mirror that reflected every choice he'd made, every moment he'd chosen work over love, every time he'd told himself that tomorrow would be soon enough for the conversations that mattered. The question that terrified him wasn't whether he deserved a second chance. It was whether there was enough time left to earn one. The ambulance lurched to a stop outside BC Children's Hospital, but before the doors opened, Sarah's phone buzzed against the metal bench. She glanced at the screen, and Wei Ming watched her face transform, the careful control she'd maintained since the film set cracking like ice under pressure. "What is it?" Wei Ming asked, but Sarah was already answering the call. "Dr. Martinez?" "Yes, we're here now." A pause. Her grip on Lucy's hand tightened. "What do you mean, moved up?" Lucy's eyes found Wei Ming's, still sharp despite the oxygen mask. Those dark irises held a question he couldn't answer, a fear he recognized from his own childhood when adults spoke in code around hospital beds. "How much time?" Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper. The paramedic began preparing for transfer, but Wei Ming couldn't look away from Sarah's face. He'd seen that expression before, on his own wife's features 35 years ago, when the doctors had explained that cancer doesn't negotiate with schedules, or hope, or the desperate bargains parents make in hospital corridors. Sarah ended the call and sat motionless, staring at her phone as if it might ring again with different news. "Sarah," Wei Ming said carefully, "what did the doctor say?" Instead of answering, she reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, worn soft at the edges from handling. Her hands shook as she opened it. "I wasn't going to show you this," she said, extracting a letter. The paper was creased from folding and refolding, the ink slightly faded. "David wrote it the night before he died. He was coming to see you." The words hit Wei Ming like a stunt gone wrong. The moment when you realize the safety cables have failed and you're falling towards something that will either kill you or change everything forever. "He was driving to Vancouver," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength from finally speaking the truth she'd carried for 3 years. Lucy was 4. The leukemia had just gone into remission, and David said it was time. Time to bring her home to meet her grandfather. Wei Ming's hands trembled as he took the letter. Through the ambulance's small window, he could see orderlies approaching with a wheelchair, but their movement seemed distant, unreal. Nothing existed except the envelope in his hands and the impossible weight of what Sarah was telling him. "He never made it past Kamloops," she whispered. "Black ice on the Coquihalla." The letter was in his jacket pocket when they found him. Lucy pulled off her oxygen mask. "Mama, show him the other thing." "Lucy, sweetheart, show him." Sarah reached into the envelope again and withdrew a photograph. Wei Ming's breath caught. It was the picture Lucy had described. David at 5, mid-flip in their old backyard. Wei Ming's hands spotted to catch him if he fell. But someone had drawn on it with crayon, adding a small figure beside David. A child with pigtails and a wide smile, inserted into a memory from 20 years before her birth. "She drew herself into all his childhood pictures," Sarah said, tears finally breaking free. David used to tell her stories about growing up on film sets, about watching her grandfather make impossible things look real. She thought if she put herself in the pictures, maybe she could go back and meet him. Wei Ming stared at the photograph, at his granddaughter's innocent attempt to rewrite history with Crayola markers. David's letter felt impossibly heavy in his other hand, 30 years of silence compressed into folded paper. "Why now?" he asked, though he was beginning to understand. "Why bring her here?" Sarah wiped her eyes, and when she looked at him, Wei Ming saw the same stubborn determination that had driven David to perfect every flip, every stunt, every impossible thing he'd tried to master to earn his father's attention. "Because Lucy's doctors moved up her timeline. The new treatments aren't working." Sarah's voice broke on the words. "She has weeks, not months. And David's letter, it wasn't just about reconciliation. He found out about your wife, about how you lost her. He understood finally why you were so afraid of getting close to anyone again." The ambulance doors opened, letting in the Vancouver rain and the sound of the hospital's emergency entrance. But Wei Ming couldn't move. The letter in his hands contained words from a son he'd thought died hating him, and somewhere in the space between those unsent apologies and Lucy's crayon-modified photograph, everything he'd believed about his failures was being rewritten. "Sir, we need to get the patient inside," the orderly said. Lucy reached for Wei Ming's hand. "Will you read Daddy's letter out loud? I want to hear what he said about you." As they lifted her onto the gurney, Wei Ming realized that Sarah hadn't just brought him a dying granddaughter and a letter from his dead son. She'd brought him the one thing he'd thought was lost forever, the truth about David's final thoughts, and the chance to discover whether love could survive the weight of all their accumulated regrets. The hospital's automatic doors swallowed them into a world of antiseptic brightness and barely controlled chaos. Wei Ming clutched David's letter while following Lucy's gurney through corridors that smelled like his wife's final weeks, industrial disinfectant layered over the metallic tang of fear. His granddaughter's small hand reached for him as nurses swarmed around her, checking monitors, adjusting 4 lines, transforming her from a child into a patient with practiced efficiency. "I need to find Dr. Martinez," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Can you stay with—" "I'm not going anywhere," Wei Ming interrupted, surprising himself with the certainty. But as Sarah disappeared around a corner, Wei Ming felt the familiar urge to run. 30 years of emotional muscle memory screamed at him to find an exit, to return to the safety of stunt coordination, where every risk was calculated and every fall was rehearsed. Hospitals were places where control meant nothing, where all his expertise in keeping people safe crumbled against invisible enemies too small to fight. "Mr. Chen?" A nurse appeared beside him, tablet in hand. "I need to update Lucy's emergency contacts. Sarah listed you as grandfather, but your information is incomplete." The words hung in the air like smoke from a botched explosion. Grandfather. The title felt foreign, unearned. Wei Ming started to correct her, to explain that he'd just discovered Lucy's existence, that he had no legal right to be here. But Lucy's eyes found his through the chaos of medical activity. "He lives in Burnaby," she said matter-of-factly. "Unit 402, Brentwood Towers. He has a red motorcycle but doesn't ride it anymore because it reminds him of Daddy. The nurse looked between them, clearly sensing undercurrents she couldn't navigate. Wei Ming stared at Lucy, his mouth dry. She was right about everything. Address, apartment number, the Ducati gathering dust in his parking space. Information a 7-year-old shouldn't possess. "How do you know that?" he whispered. Lucy smiled, and for a moment the hospital noise faded. "Mama and I drove past your building lots of times. We never got brave enough to knock." The admission hit Wei Ming like a stunt cable snapping under pressure. They'd been watching him. For how long? Months? Years? While he'd convinced himself that David's family had moved on completely, Sarah had been circling Vancouver's edges with a sick child, gathering intelligence about the grandfather Lucy might never meet. "Sir?" The nurse was still waiting. Wei Ming provided his information automatically, his mind reeling. As she walked away, Lucy tugged at his sleeve. "Read Daddy's letter now," she said, "before the doctors come back." Wei Ming's hands shook as he unfolded the pages. David's handwriting was smaller than he remembered, cramped with the urgency of someone racing against time. The date at the top made his chest tighten. 3 years ago, the night before the accident that had stolen his final chance at reconciliation. "Dad," Wei Ming read aloud, his voice catching on the simple word. "I know you won't expect this call, but I'm driving up tomorrow. Lucy's been asking about her grandfather, and I realized I've spent 6 years telling her stories about you without admitting I was talking about myself too." Lucy shifted on the examination table, her eyes bright with concentration. Around them, the emergency department's controlled chaos continued. Phones ringing, monitors beeping, families clustered around other gurneys fighting their own battles against time and circumstance. "I used to think you chose your work over me," Wei Ming continued. "But Sarah helped me understand what I was too young to see then. You were grieving Mom the only way you knew how, by making sure no one else got hurt on your watch, even if it meant hurting us both." The words blurred as tears gathered in Wei Ming's eyes. He looked up to find Sarah standing in the doorway, her face pale but determined. Behind her, a doctor in scrubs waited with the expression Wei Ming had learned to dread, the careful neutrality of someone bearing news that would reshape everything. "Keep reading," Lucy whispered. "Please." But before Wei Ming could continue, Sarah stepped forward. "Dr. Martinez needs to speak with us," she said quietly, "about Lucy's options." The way she emphasized options made Wei Ming's stomach drop. In his experience, options were what doctors offered when solutions had run out. "Can it wait?" he asked, folding the letter carefully. "I was just—" "No," Dr. Martinez interrupted gently, moving into their small circle. "I'm afraid it can't." As the doctor began explaining treatment protocols and timeline adjustments, Wei Ming felt the walls of his carefully constructed emotional distance crumbling. Lucy's small hand found his wrist again, checking his pulse with medical expertise no 7-year-old should possess, while David's unfinished words burned in his pocket like accusations he might never get the chance to answer. Dr. Martinez gestured toward a small consultation room, but Lucy's grip on Wei Ming's wrist tightened. "I want to hear too," she said, her voice muffled by the oxygen mask. "It's my body. I should know what's happening to it." The doctor's eyes met Sarah's over Lucy's head, a wordless conversation that excluded Wei Ming entirely. He recognized the dynamic from his own marriage's final months, the careful choreography of shared medical knowledge, decisions made in hallways, while he worked 18-hour days coordinating stunts he told himself were more important than watching his wife disappear by degrees. "The experimental treatment in Seattle," Dr. Martinez said carefully, addressing Sarah but stealing glances at Lucy. "The window has moved up significantly. We're talking days, not weeks." Wei Ming felt the floor shift beneath him, like a platform rigged to collapse. "What does that mean?" "It means the cancer is more aggressive than we hoped," Sarah said, her voice steady but hollow. "And if we're going to try the trial, Lucy needs to be strong enough to survive the journey." Lucy pulled off her oxygen mask completely. "Are you talking about the treatment that might kill me faster?" The casual way she said it, as if discussing weather or schoolwork, sent ice through Wei Ming's veins. Children weren't supposed to speak about their own deaths with such clinical detachment. But then, Children weren't supposed to have lived 3 years in oncology wards, learning medical terminology like other kids learned multiplication tables. "Sweetheart," Sarah started, but Lucy cut her off. "I heard you on the phone with Dr. Patterson last week. 20% survival rate, possible cardiac complications, and something about my bone marrow being too damaged already." She looked at Dr. Martinez with David's stubborn intelligence. "Is that right?" Dr. Martinez sat heavily in the chair beside Lucy's bed. "You're too smart for your own good, aren't you? Daddy used to say I got that from Grandpa." Lucy turned to Wei Ming. "Is it true? Are you smart too?" The question should have been simple, but Wei Ming felt it pulling at threads he'd spent decades keeping tightly woven. Smart enough to calculate trajectory and impact velocity. Smart enough to design safety systems that had saved hundreds of lives. Too stupid to call his son before it was too late. "Smart enough to make some very expensive mistakes," he said finally. Dr. Martinez cleared her throat. "The decision about Seattle needs to be made tonight. The transport, the preparation, the coordination with their team—" "No," Lucy interrupted. "I don't want to go to Seattle." Sarah's face went white. "Lucy, we discussed this. It's your best chance." 20% isn't a chance, Mama. It's just a different way to say goodbye." Lucy's voice carried a gravity that made Wei Ming's chest ache. "And I don't want to die in another hospital room where Grandpa can't visit because he's scared of flying." The casual mention of his phobia, information she couldn't possibly know, made Wei Ming's hands shake. "How did you—" "Daddy told stories," Lucy said simply, "about how you stopped taking overseas jobs after the plane to Hong Kong got stuck in a typhoon, about how you drove everywhere, even when it took 3 days instead of 3 hours." Each revelation felt like another cable snapping in a complex rigging system. For years, Wei Ming had convinced himself that David remembered only the disappointments, the missed events, the broken promises. But somehow, his son had also cataloged the small fears, the human vulnerabilities that Wei Ming had tried so hard to hide. Sarah's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it and paled further. "The Seattle team needs an answer in 2 hours. If we don't take this slot, there won't be another one," Dr. Martinez finished gently. Lucy reached for David's letter, still folded in Wei Ming's trembling hands. "Can I see what else Daddy wrote before we decide anything?" Wei Ming unfolded the pages again, his eyes scanning ahead to words he wasn't sure he could speak aloud. David's handwriting grew more urgent in the later paragraphs, as if he'd known time was running out, though not in the way any of them had expected. "The thing about Lucy is that she sees through everything," Wei Ming read, his voice barely steady. "Just like you used to see through Mom's brave face when the chemo made her sick. Lucy knows she might not get better, but she also knows that being afraid of dying isn't the same as being afraid of living." The words hit the small room like concussion waves. Wei Ming looked up to find both Sarah and Dr. Martinez staring at him, waiting for him to continue reading, waiting for David's voice from beyond the grave to provide answers none of them possessed. But Lucy was watching him with those impossibly knowing eyes, and Wei Ming realized that the choice about Seattle wasn't really about medical procedures or survival statistics. It was about whether a family that had been broken by silence and distance could find a way to be whole again before time ran out completely. Wei Ming's hands trembled as he continued reading David's letter, but the next paragraph made him stop breathing entirely. "I need you to know that Lucy wasn't an accident, Dad. Sarah and I planned her pregnancy specifically because I was already showing symptoms." "What?" Sarah's voice cut through the room like a blade. "David never. That's not true." Wei Ming looked up from the letter, seeing his own confusion reflected in Sarah's face. Lucy's expression, however, remained eerily calm, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "I know Sarah will be upset when she reads this," Wei Ming continued, his voice growing hoarse. "But the neurological episode started when I was 24. The same age Mom was when her symptoms began. I knew I had her condition, the hereditary one you never told me about." The room went dead silent except for the mechanical whisper of Lucy's oxygen concentrator. Sarah's face had gone beyond pale into something approaching gray. "Hereditary condition?" Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "What hereditary condition?" Wei Ming's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. For 30 years, he'd convinced himself that David didn't need to know, that the genetic counselors were wrong, that lightning couldn't strike the same family twice. Sarah stood so abruptly her chair toppled backward. "You knew?" Her voice was barely human. "You knew David might inherit whatever killed your wife, and you said nothing?" "The doctors said it was only a 30% chance," Wei Ming whispered, the words ash in his mouth. "And David seemed fine. He was always fine." "Sign?" Sarah's laugh bordered on hysteria. Those headaches he had, the coordination problems that ended his stunt work, the seizures that started right before Lucy was born. She grabbed the letter from Wei Ming's hands. "Lucy wasn't an accident. What does that even mean?" Lucy's small voice cut through their rising panic. "It means Daddy knew he was going to die, so he wanted to leave part of himself behind. But he also wanted to make sure I knew about the family I came from before it was too late." The matter-of-fact way she spoke those words, as if a 7-year-old discussing her father's calculated decision to procreate before his genetic death sentence, shattered something fundamental in the room. Dr. Martinez was frantically making notes, but her clinical composure had cracked. "Lucy," Sarah said, kneeling beside the bed, "Honey, that's not— Daddy didn't plan you because he was sick. He planned you because we loved each other. Both things can be true, Mama." Lucy reached for the letter again. "Can I see the rest?" Sarah clutched the pages against her chest. No, this changes everything. If David knew about some genetic condition, if there's something hereditary." She whirled on Wei Ming. "What exactly did your wife die from?" Wei Ming felt the walls closing in like a stunt gone catastrophically wrong. Early onset Huntington's disease. She was diagnosed at 25, died at 28. The same age David was when he died in that car accident that maybe wasn't an accident. Sarah finished, her voice deadly quiet. The accusation hung between them like smoke from an explosion. Wei Ming saw the exact moment Sarah's grief transformed into something harder, more dangerous. She was remembering David's final months. The mood swings, the increasingly reckless behavior, the night drives that lasted hours. "The genetic test results," she said slowly. "David had blood work done the month before he died. He said it was for life insurance, but the results never came." She looked at Dr. Martinez. "If Huntington's is hereditary, there's a 50% chance Lucy inherited it," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "But we'd need specific genetic testing to confirm. And given her current condition—" "Given my current condition, it doesn't matter," Lucy interrupted. "Grandpa, what else does Daddy's letter say?" Wei Ming couldn't look at her. The child lying in that hospital bed wasn't just fighting leukemia. She might be carrying the same genetic time bomb that had killed her grandmother and father. And he, the man who spent his life calculating risks and preventing disasters, had set this tragedy in motion 30 years ago by staying silent. "Wei Ming." Sarah's voice had gone cold as winter fog. "The letter. Read it." With hands that felt disconnected from his body, Wei Ming unfolded the pages. David's handwriting blurred as tears finally broke free, but he forced himself to continue. "I need you to watch over Lucy if something happens to me. Not just because she's your granddaughter, but because she's going to face the same choice Mom faced, the same choice I'm facing now, whether to live fully with the time she has or spend it all being afraid." The revelation crashed over them like a demolition sequence Wei Ming had triggered without understanding the blast radius. Lucy wasn't just dying from leukemia. She was potentially carrying a genetic death sentence that connected her to a grandmother she'd never met, and a father whose final choices suddenly made devastating sense. And Wei Ming, the man who'd built his career on keeping people safe, had orchestrated the entire tragedy through 30 years of cowardice disguised as protection. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Wei Ming watched Sarah pace the small room like a caged animal, her earlier grief transforming into something fiercer, more dangerous. Lucy remained unnaturally still on the examination table, her oxygen mask fogging with each breath, while she studied both adults with David's unnervingly perceptive eyes. 30 years, Sarah finally said, her voice barely controlled. 30 years you let us believe David's death was random, an accident, bad weather and worse timing. She stopped pacing to face Wei Ming directly. But he knew, didn't he? About the Huntingtons. About what was coming. Wei Ming couldn't meet her gaze. The letter trembled in his hands as more of David's words swam into focus, words he'd written knowing they might be the last chance to explain choices that had seemed inexplicable to everyone who loved him. "Sarah will hate me for keeping this secret," Wei Ming read, his voice cracking. "But I couldn't watch her spend our final months together counting down days instead of living them. The same way I couldn't let Lucy grow up afraid of a future that might never come." Dr. Martinez quietly excused herself, muttering about consulting with colleagues. But Wei Ming knew she was simply giving them space to detonate 30 years of accumulated secrets without medical supervision. "Keep reading," Lucy whispered, pulling off her oxygen mask completely despite Sarah's protests. "I need to understand what Daddy was thinking." Sarah's laugh held no humor whatsoever. What he was thinking? He was thinking like a Chen man, that keeping everyone in the dark was the same as protecting them. Her eyes blazed as she turned back to Wei Ming. "Just like you thought protecting David from his genetic history would somehow make it disappear." The accusation hit Wei Ming like a falling stunt rig. Because she was right. He'd spent David's entire childhood believing that silence could somehow insulate his son from inherited tragedy, as if not speaking about Huntington's disease would prevent it from manifesting, the way avoiding certain Hong Kong film sets had once helped him forget his fear of heights. "The seizures started 3 months after Lucy's first birthday," Wei Ming continued reading, each word feeling like broken glass. "By then, I knew for certain what I'd inherited. But I also knew I'd given Sarah and Lucy something Mom never got to give me, time together before the disease took everything away." Lucy reached for Sarah's hand. "Mama, you're crying." "I'm furious," Sarah corrected, though tears were streaming down her face. "At your father for lying to me. At your grandfather for starting this chain of secrets. At myself for not seeing what was right in front of me." She looked at Wei Ming with something approaching hatred. Those night drives David took near the end, the increasing isolation, the way he started giving away his possessions. He was saying goodbye. Wei Ming finished quietly, the way my wife did, piece by piece, so it would hurt less when the final moment came. But Sarah shook her head violently. "No, don't you dare make this sound noble. David died alone on a mountain road in the middle of a rainstorm because he was too much of a coward to tell me the truth. Because he learned from the master," she gestured at Wei Ming, "that keeping secrets is the same as keeping people safe." The words hit Wei Ming like a perfectly calculated knockout punch. Because she was absolutely right. David had learned his emotional choreography from watching his father, the careful distance, the protective silence, the way love could be expressed through absence rather than presence. "I know this will destroy Dad when he finds out," Wei Ming read from the letter, his voice barely audible now. "But maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe the only way to break this cycle of silence is to force someone to finally tell the truth." Lucy struggled to sit up straighter, her face pale but determined. What cycle of silence? Wei Ming looked at his granddaughter, this impossibly brave child who might be carrying the same genetic time bomb that had killed her grandmother and father, and felt something inside him finally break open completely. "Your grandmother died believing I loved my work more than I loved her," he said, the words coming out like blood from a reopened wound. "Your father died believing the same thing. But the truth is, I was terrified. Terrified of hospitals, of watching people I loved disappear, of facing my own helplessness." He gestured around the room. "This, being here, watching you fight for your life, this is my worst nightmare, and I've spent 30 years running from it." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, rage mixing with something that might have been understanding. Lucy, however, smiled for the first time since the letter reading began. "But you're here now," she said simply. "Even though you're scared." Wei Ming nodded, tears flowing freely. "Even though I'm terrified." "Then maybe," Lucy said, reaching for both their hands, "we can figure out how to be scared together instead of alone." The simple wisdom in Lucy's words hung in the air like dust motes caught in hospital light. For a moment, the three of them sat connected by her small hands, 3 generations linked by grief, secrets, and the terrible courage required to face truth. But Sarah pulled away first. "No," she said, standing abruptly. No, I'm sorry, but I can't. Her voice cracked as she looked between Wei Ming and Lucy. Being scared together is beautiful in theory, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring David back. It doesn't cure Lucy's leukemia. And it sure as hell doesn't undo 30 years of lies. Wei Ming felt his granddaughter's hand slip from his as Lucy settled back against her pillows, watching her mother with those two knowing eyes. Mama. Don't. Sarah's composure finally shattered completely. Don't mama me with that wise little voice, like you understand things you shouldn't have to understand. You're 7 years old. You should be worried about homework and playground drama, not whether you inherited your dead father's death sentence. The rawness in her voice made Wei Ming flinch, but Lucy remained steady. But I'm not 7 and worried about homework, she said quietly. I'm 7 and in a hospital bed, and pretending that's not true won't change it. She's right. Wei Ming's voice surprised even himself with its firmness. And David was right too. This cycle has to break somewhere. Sarah whirled on him. Don't you dare quote my dead husband's letter at me like it's some kind of wisdom. David chose to die alone rather than fight his disease. That's not wisdom, that's giving up, Wei Ming said, rising from his chair with more conviction than he'd felt in decades. David chose to give you and Lucy 3 years of normal life before the symptoms became impossible to hide. He chose to let Lucy remember him as her strong, funny daddy, instead of watching him deteriorate into someone she wouldn't recognize. That wasn't his choice to make alone. Sarah's voice rose to near shouting, and somewhere down the hall a nurse looked up from her station. You're right, Wei Ming said simply. Just like it wasn't my choice to make alone 30 years ago when I decided David was better off not knowing about his mother's condition. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they wanted to cross. Lucy's oxygen concentrator hummed steadily, marking time they couldn't afford to waste. The difference, Wei Ming continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, is that we still have choices to make about Lucy's treatment, about the genetic testing, about whether we repeat the same patterns or find a different way. Sarah's anger seemed to deflate slightly, leaving her looking exhausted and lost. What different way? Lucy's cancer is stage 4. If she has Huntington's too, then we face it, Wei Ming interrupted. Together. The way I should have faced your grandmother's diagnosis instead of burying myself in 18-hour film shoots. The way David should have faced his symptoms instead of driving alone into that storm. Lucy's small voice cut through their exchange. The way I want to face whatever happens next. Not alone in some hospital in Seattle, but here, with both of you. Sarah sank back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. The trial in Seattle is your best chance. 20% isn't a chance, Mama. Remember? Lucy's matter-of-fact tone carried David's stubborn logic. And even if it worked, even if I survived the treatment, I'd still need the genetic test eventually. I'd still need to know if Daddy left me more than just his eyes and his stubborn streak. Wei Ming looked at his granddaughter, this impossibly brave child who spoke about inherited death sentences with the same calm she'd shown when asking about his stunt work, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. The fear was still there, the terror of hospitals and helplessness and watching people disappear. But underneath it was something he hadn't felt in 30 years, the absolute certainty that running away would be worse than staying. Then we find out, he said quietly. Together. Whatever the test shows, whatever happens next, we face it as a family. Sarah looked up at him through tears. And if the genetic test is positive? If Lucy has 15, maybe 20 good years before? Then we make them count, Wei Ming said, reaching for his granddaughter's hand again. All of them. The way I should have done with your grandmother. The way David should have done with you. Lucy squeezed his fingers with surprising strength. Will you teach me about stunts, the safe kind, not the dangerous ones? Wei Ming's laugh came out half-sob. The whole point of stunts is making dangerous things safe. That's what we do. We calculate risks, we plan for every contingency, and we trust our team to catch us when we fall. Then teach me that, Lucy said simply. How to trust people to catch me. Looking at his granddaughter's face, David's eyes and his wife's bone structure, carrying genes that might kill her but also carrying love that could save them all. Wei Ming finally understood what David had been trying to tell him in that letter. Sometimes the greatest stunt of all is learning how to fall safely into the arms of people who love you. 2 months later, Wei Ming stood in the same Vancouver hospital corridor where everything had changed, but this time the fog outside was lifting. Through the windows, he could see patches of blue breaking through gray clouds, the kind of weather David used to call possibility sky. Lucy's laughter echoed from the physical therapy room as she practiced walking with her new prosthetic leg, Sarah steadying her while a therapist adjusted the fit. The amputation had been necessary after the infection spread, but Lucy had approached it with the same matter-of-fact courage she'd shown through everything else. "Pirates have peg legs," she'd told Wei Ming the night before surgery. "I'm going to be a stunt pirate." The genetic test results had arrived 3 weeks ago, positive for Huntington's disease, but with a variant that might not manifest symptoms until her 40s, if she lived that long. The leukemia had gone into unexpected remission after an experimental treatment Sarah had found, one that required staying in Vancouver rather than fleeing to Seattle. Sometimes, Wei Ming had learned, the greatest leap of faith was trusting the ground beneath your feet instead of searching for somewhere else to land. "Grandpa!" Lucy's voice cut through his reverie. She was standing in the doorway, balanced on her prosthetic, grinning with David's stubborn joy. "Watch this." She took 3 careful steps forward, wobbled, caught herself on the wall, then looked back at him with triumph blazing in her eyes. "I'm learning to fall safely, just like you taught me." Wei Ming's throat tightened. Over the past 2 months, he'd spent every day at the hospital, not running 18-hour film shoots, but learning the rhythm of Lucy's treatments, Sarah's fears, the way grief could slowly transform into something that looked almost like hope. He'd read David's complete letter, all 12 pages of it, and discovered his son had forgiven him years ago. The tragedy wasn't that David had died angry, it was that Wei Ming had spent 30 years believing anger was all he'd left behind. "The physical therapist says she'll be ready to go home next week," Sarah said, appearing beside Lucy. Her relationship with Wei Ming remained complicated, part daughter, part adversary, part fellow soldier in a war against time. But they'd learned to trust each other's commitment to Lucy's future, even when they disagreed about tactics. "Home," Wei Ming repeated. The word still felt foreign. Sarah had asked him to stay in Vancouver after Lucy's discharge, to be part of their daily life, rather than the distant figure he'd been to David. The offer terrified him almost as much as those first moments when Lucy had collapsed on the film set. "Unless you've got some big movie to coordinate," Lucy said, pretending nonchalance but watching his face carefully. "Some really important stunts that can't wait." Wei Ming knelt to her eye level, steadying himself against the wall. At 58, his knees protested more than they used to, but he'd learned there were some moments worth the discomfort. "I've been thinking about that," he said seriously, "and I realized something. The most important stunt work of my career isn't on some film set. It's right here, teaching you how to calculate risks, how to trust your safety team." He gestured toward Sarah. "How to make dangerous things safe." Lucy's eyes widened. "You mean it? You're staying?" "I'm staying." The words came easier than he'd expected. "But I need you to promise me something." "What?" "When the Huntington symptoms start, if they start, you don't disappear the way your father did. You don't try to protect us by pushing us away. We face it together, as a team. Deal?" Lucy considered this with David's thoughtful intensity. "Even if it gets really scary? Especially if it gets scary. That's when you need your safety crew the most." She nodded solemnly, then broke into that radiant smile that transformed her whole face. "Deal. But I get to teach you something too." "What's that?" "How to not be afraid of hospitals." She gestured around the corridor that had become their second home. "They're not really scary places where people go to disappear. Sometimes they're places where people learn how to stay." Wei Ming felt tears threatening. The easy tears he'd discovered came with allowing himself to feel everything instead of nothing. Lucy was right, of course. The hospital wasn't a place of endings, but of continuings. David's love continuing through Lucy, his wife's strength continuing through Sarah's fierce protectiveness. Even the Huntington's gene continuing, but alongside it, the accumulated wisdom of 2 generations who'd learned to face their fears instead of fleeing them. Outside, the fog had lifted completely, revealing the city David had loved, the mountains where he died, the sky that stretched toward a future none of them could predict, but all of them would face together. Lucy took his hand with surprising strength. "Come on, Grandpa. Let's practice falling safely." As they walked slowly down the corridor, 3 generations linked by grief transformed into grace, by secrets transformed into trust, Wei Ming finally understood the difference between a good stunt and a great one. A good stunt looks impossible but feels safe. A great stunt teaches you that falling can be the beginning of flying.